5 true scary stories from the House of Horrors, uncovering a family's darkest secrets. When we first moved into the old house on the edge of the East Coast suburbs, I was struck by its grandeur. The house was weathered but stately, the kind of place that seemed to have a soul. Each window, each faded panel seemed to hold a history, a glimpse into the lives of families who had once called it home. The air was heavy with something I couldn't quite name, a presence that felt both unsettling and comforting, as though the house had been waiting for us. At first, the quirks of the house were easy enough to overlook. Every old building creaks, every staircase sighs. But here, things were different. There was a rhythm to the sounds, a strange, deliberate cadence to the way the stairs would groan or the way the pipes would hum late at night, as if the house itself were breathing in some slow, mournful way. The lights had their own personalities too, flaring up at unexpected moments, flickering off when I least expected it. I began to feel that the house was aware of me, watching and listening in ways that I couldn't quite shake. During the first few nights, I would lie awake listening. My wife and our young daughter would sleep soundly beside me, oblivious to the subtle noises that would creep into the silence. A creak here, a soft tap there. Sometimes it would be the faintest sigh from the floorboards, as if they were shifting under some invisible weight. Other times, I'd swear I heard footsteps moving slowly across the floor above us. The strangest thing was the feeling the house gave me. It was as if it knew where I had been, as if it recognized my presence and responded to it. I could sense it following me, in its way, a warmth at my back when I turned, a prickling sensation when I'd lingered too long in one spot. There was a dim light in the hallway that would never seem to fully turn off, just flickering enough to remind me that it was still there, still waiting. It was only after a week or so that I started noticing more peculiar things that didn't just go bump in the night, but seemed almost intentional, as though the house was testing me, inching closer. I felt compelled to start writing it down, to record the details, in case they meant something later. Perhaps it was just my own paranoia creeping in, but as I wrote, I realized how deep my fascination with this house ran. It was unlike any place I'd ever lived. It felt alive. Story 1. Cursed Family Residences. It began one stormy afternoon, the kind that sends a chill through the bones and darkens the sky at midday. I had been clearing out the attic, hoping to organize the dusty space filled with forgotten boxes and broken furniture left by previous owners. Amid the clutter, my hand brushed against something worn and strangely heavy, a large old-fashioned scrapbook, its edges frayed, and the leather cover cracked from decades of neglect. Opening it, I was met with the scent of aged paper, thick and musty. I brushed off the dust, and on the first page, there was a newspaper clipping from 1910, yellowed and brittle, detailing the death of a man named Charles Emery, who'd been the first known owner of this house. It was a small article, but ominous in its brevity. Local businessman found dead in his study. It read, in what police describe as a tragic accident. I scanned the sparse text and felt a chill. The tone, restrained and cold, made me wonder what they weren't saying. I turned the page, feeling a strange mixture of dread and compulsion. With each turn, a pattern emerged, revealing itself slowly, quietly, like the faint crackle of a radio channel as it shifts into focus. One family after another had lived here over the years, and each one had left a grim trace behind. Bankruptcy in 1927, a mysterious fire in 1939, a lost child in 1951. The details varied, but the misfortunes persisted, haunting every page with a chilling uniformity. My hands began to tremble as I continued to flip through the yellowed pages. The house seemed to claim something from each family that dared to settle here, a silent toll it exacted. The clippings grew darker, each hinting at hidden tragedies and untimely ends, each name now a part of the house's insatiable history. I couldn't shake the sensation that they were all watching me now, as if these past lives clung to the walls, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next page to turn. Then one article stopped me cold. The photograph showed a family that looked oddly familiar. The man's face bore an unsettling resemblance to my own. His smile was faint, as if he knew what was coming. The caption read, "Local father found dead in mysterious circumstances. Family leaves town in haste." A chill spread across my skin. His fate felt like a premonition, a warning of something lying just ahead, unseen but inevitable. The attic felt darker now, and each breath seemed to stir the dust more than the last. I could almost sense the house around me, leaning in, listening. I thought I saw a movement in the corner of my eye, a faint shadow lingering just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned, but nothing was there. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching, hiding in the forgotten spaces of this old house. The scrapbook grew heavier in my lap as I realized that each clipping I read brought me closer to the same fate, like stepping onto an inevitable path from which there would be no return. I could feel the house closing in, wrapping me in the same dark legacy that had claimed so many before me. Story 2: Bloodstained Walls. The stains appeared subtly at first, small, dark smudges along the wall in the living room. I dismissed them as part of the house's age, marks left by the hands of children, or maybe a lingering shadow from furniture once pressed too close. But as the days passed, the stains grew darker and more pronounced, spreading like a slow, creeping mold, reaching up and out in strange, uneven patterns. Each morning, I would scrub the wall, leaning in close as I scoured it with bleach and hot water. And each time, it seemed as if I'd made progress. But the stains would reappear by the evening, as though they had been waiting for the chance to breathe free once more. Over the following weeks, I realized they weren't just random marks. They were forming shapes, vague at first, but unmistakable once they took hold. A handprint, faint and open-palmed, pressed against the plaster near the doorway. Fingers splayed as if reaching out. Other shapes, too, appeared, ones that looked disturbingly like faces, twisted and shadowed, as though figures were trapped just beneath the surface, straining to escape. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the cool, flat surface of the wall, as if I could somehow reach into the space between and pull whatever was there back out into the light. At night, the house would grow silent, but the quiet seemed too thick, as though something were pressing against it. That was when the sounds began, muffled and faint at first, like the whisper of a draft, soon unmistakable. Soft, desperate sobbing seemed to drift from the very walls themselves, filling the air like a song that had been waiting to be heard. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks with my mind, but each night, as I lay in bed, the sobbing grew closer, as if someone, or many someones, were trapped just out of reach, crying for a release that would never come. The days passed in a strange haze, the marks growing darker each time I scrubbed them away, as though the walls were feeding off my efforts, reveling in my desperation. One night, after hours of scrubbing, I stumbled to bed exhausted, my hands raw from the harsh cleaning solutions. I fell into a restless sleep, the sobbing still echoing in my ears. And when I finally awoke, the morning sun was filtering through the window, casting a pale glow across the room. As I entered the living room, I froze. On the wall, just where I had been scrubbing the night before, was an image that stopped my heart, a distorted version of my own face, smeared in dark streaks, the mouth twisted into a silent scream. The eyes were hollow, wide, and unseeing, but unmistakably my own, as though I had somehow left a piece of myself behind, trapped within the walls. I reached out, touching the stain, feeling the cold dampness against my fingertips, and a chill ran down my spine. The wall felt alive, pulsing faintly beneath my touch, as though it held within it the memories of every person who had ever dared to reside here. I pulled my hand back, breath hitching, and looked down to find my fingers marked with faint, dark streaks, the same marks that covered the wall. It was as if the stains had bled into my skin, leaving their own claim upon me. I backed away slowly, watching the walls as they seemed to shift and breathe, shadows forming and twisting, almost alive in the dim morning light. The house felt less like a shelter and more like a trap, as if it were pulling me in, leaving its mark on me in ways I couldn't understand. In the following days, The marks only grew bolder, the hands and faces pressing more urgently against the wall, each new detail making it harder to ignore the feeling that they were watching me, remembering me. I began to sense the weight of their stories, of all the lives and suffering these walls had witnessed, absorbed, and retained. It was as though the house itself remembered every moment, every pain, and now it wanted me to remember them too. The sobbing continued, louder now, almost anguished, resonating through every corner of the house until it became impossible to tell where the walls ended and where my own skin began. Story 3: Disappearing Furniture. At first, I barely noticed when small things began to shift. An old vase moving from the windowsill to the table overnight. A book I'd left open on the armchair, reappearing neatly closed on the shelf. I assumed I was just misplacing things, my mind cluttered from the exhaustion of settling into a new home. But as days passed, the changes became harder to ignore. Objects that were deeply familiar would vanish entirely, only to reappear in the most improbable places as though something was playing a game of hide and seek, testing the limits of my sanity. One night, I entered the bedroom to find a large antique mirror that hung on the wall opposite the bed missing. It had been there that morning, I was certain. My partner hadn't moved it, and neither of us could imagine why we would. It was far too heavy to relocate on a whim. I searched the entire house, feeling increasingly unsettled as I checked every room and closet. I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself it would turn up. The next morning, as I was cleaning out the attic, I found the mirror lying on the dusty floor, its ornate frame dulled by age but somehow intact. Except now, the glass was shattered in a web of fine cracks, like the veins of a leaf, each line delicate yet haunting. I felt an eerie chill as I touched it, sensing a lingering unease, as though the mirror itself had been waiting for me. How had it gotten here? Who could have moved it without me knowing? The unsettling displacements continued, but what unnerved me most was the reappearance of a family heirloom that had remained tucked away in a box since we moved in. A small, intricately carved music box passed down from my grandmother. I remembered its faint melody from childhood, a delicate, lilting tune that always filled me with a peculiar melancholy. I kept it stored in a drawer, rarely thinking of it, but one evening I walked into the dining room to find it sitting neatly in the center of the table, lid open, as if someone had been listening to its tune. It began to play, softly at first, the sound almost blending into the silence of the house. The music was slow, mournful, every note stretched out as if it, too, were bound by some mysterious force. I watched, transfixed, as the tiny ballerina spun in circles, her delicate figure twirling to the melody, even though I had not wound it in years. I closed the lid, my heart racing, but later that night, I heard the tune again, drifting faintly from somewhere within the house. I followed it down the hall, peering into each room, but the sound seemed to move, leading me deeper into the shadows until it suddenly stopped, leaving only an unnatural silence in its place. The music box began appearing in different rooms, like a twisted game. I would leave it in the bedroom, only to find it resting on the kitchen counter the next morning. Its lid would be open, the ballerina frozen mid-spin, as if someone had interrupted her dance. Each time, the song felt slower, more distorted, as if weighed down by sorrow. I tried locking it away, but it didn't matter. Somehow, the box would reappear, its haunting melody drifting through the house, whispering memories of a life that had once filled these rooms. Other items followed suit, disappearing and returning changed, their familiar shapes holding some new, sinister quality. A chair in the corner of the study, old but sturdy, vanished one evening, and when it reappeared in the hallway, one leg was shorter than the others, causing it to list sideways, as if it too was struggling to stand. My favorite mug vanished from the kitchen, and days later I found it shattered in the guest bedroom, shards arranged in a peculiar spiral pattern on the floor. It felt deliberate, like a message I couldn't quite decipher. The pattern grew bolder, more intricate. I began to feel as though some unseen presence were rearranging my life, shifting pieces of my reality just enough to keep me unsettled, to keep me guessing. Even the most ordinary objects felt foreign now, as though they belonged to someone or something else. It was as if the house itself were remaking my space, nudging me to see it through a lens I couldn't fully comprehend. And as the music box played, night after night, I started to wonder, was this an invitation, a warning, or something far darker? The air grew heavier, the shadows more pronounced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching, patient and knowing, moving its pieces with a twisted intent. I was no longer sure where I ended and the house began, our boundaries blurring with each new disappearance and reappearance. Each stolen fragment of familiarity returned to me transformed. Story 4. Eerie Staircases. The staircase was one of the grand features that first drew us to the house. A wide, sweeping structure of polished oak with a banister worn smooth by decades of hands. It was stately and dignified, spiraling down from the upper floor like a path leading to some hidden depth. But from the very first night, the stairs seemed to hold secrets of their own. Each step had its own distinct creak, but the unsettling part was how the sounds shifted, never quite aligning with my own footsteps. In the quiet hours, when the house was cloaked in shadow, I would hear the faintest creak, a soft, hesitant press, as if someone were testing their weight on each stair behind me. At first, I brushed it off, chalking it up to the house settling or the inevitable quirks of an old structure. But each time I went down alone, I could feel it, a slight, almost imperceptible change in the air behind me, the weight of something unseen, just a step behind. The sensation grew over time, a creeping dread that took hold of my spine every time I set foot on those steps. It wasn't just the sound, it was the feeling that something was there, lingering, watching. One evening, as I climbed down the staircase, I felt the hair on my neck prick up. My own steps sounded hollow, swallowed by an oppressive silence. And then, distinctly, I heard it, a footfall on the step behind me, mirroring my descent. The sound was light but unmistakable, almost like the hesitant tread of a child. I froze, my hand gripping the banister, feeling the wood press against my skin as though trying to ground me. I turned, my heart racing, expecting to see nothing but the empty staircase. But the air felt thick, charged with a presence I couldn't see. I forced myself to look up at the family portraits hanging on the walls, their eyes watching with a peculiar intensity, as if they too knew what lingered in the house. But there was no one there, just the quiet, heavy atmosphere of the empty steps below. It was only later, as I was unpacking a box of old belongings we'd found in the attic, that I discovered a bundle of faded photographs. The images were grainy, capturing the staircase in various states, sometimes with the family gathered on it, sometimes with the house as empty as it was now. But in each picture, down at the base of the staircase, was a shadowy figure. It was hazy, almost like a smudge, but unmistakable, a person, half-formed, standing there, watching the stairs. With each photograph, the figure grew darker, more distinct, and though I couldn't make out its face, the posture and stillness unnerved me. It seemed to be waiting. One night, as I was heading down to get a glass of water, I paused halfway, gripping the banister tightly. I could feel it, that strange presence growing stronger. The air felt stifling, as though something were pressing down on me. And then, behind me, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of rapid footsteps, each step closer, like someone racing down the stairs, eager to catch up. My blood ran cold, and I forced myself to turn, heart pounding, only to find the staircase empty, stretching upward into shadow. But as I looked back down, I felt the faintest brush against my shoulder, a cold, intangible pressure, like fingers resting lightly on me, holding me in place. It was gone in an instant, but the sensation lingered, as if something had been there, just out of sight, reaching for me. The next morning, I went back to the photos, studying the figure at the bottom of the staircase. It was clearer now, almost detailed. In the dim light, it looked like the outline of a woman, her form blending into the shadows, but with eyes fixed forward, intense and unyielding, waiting at the base of the steps. And though I couldn't explain it, I felt a shiver of recognition, as though I had seen her somewhere before. Story 5. Phantom Footsteps. There's a certain peace that descends in the quiet hours of the night when the house finally settles. For a while, I was lulled by this calm, feeling that maybe, just maybe, the house had offered me a temporary reprieve. But then, like clockwork, it began. At first, it was faint, so soft I thought it might be my imagination, a whisper of sound like someone pacing gently on the floor above. I'd lie in bed, straining to listen, trying to convince myself that the noise was just the house settling. But every night, just around midnight, the footsteps would begin anew, slow and deliberate, moving from one end of the room upstairs to the other. One evening, as the footsteps started again, I finally worked up the courage to investigate. I crept up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. Reaching the upper floor, I felt a wave of cold settle over me, the air thick and still, like a silent warning. The corridor stretched ahead, empty and unyielding, but the footsteps had stopped. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding in the silence, feeling as though something unseen was watching me, waiting. Over the next few days, the footsteps became a nightly occurrence, each one louder than the last. They moved with a strange rhythm, as if someone were wandering aimlessly, lost in their own home. The sound grew more insistent, pacing from room to room, sometimes pausing directly over where I lay. I could feel the vibrations in the floor, as though someone heavy were passing by, just out of sight. The strangest part was that I began to expect it, lying in bed each night, waiting for the sound to start, holding my breath as the first faint steps began. One night, the footsteps came to a halt right outside my bedroom door. I lay there, heart thundering, unable to breathe. There was a silence so thick I could almost touch it, as though the house itself were holding its breath with me. And then, just as I began to relax, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of the doorknob turning slowly, deliberately. The door didn't open, but I could feel the presence, standing just outside, waiting. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, before the footsteps started up again, fading back down the hallway and into the shadows. That night, I barely slept, lying wide-eyed in the dark, listening to every creak and whisper the house offered. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it, that it was just the product of an overactive mind in an old, drafty house. But that night, the footsteps returned, closer, louder, like an echo growing stronger with each passing day. Then came the night when I awoke to find the footsteps not above me, nor in the hallway, but beside me. I lay completely still, too terrified to move. I could feel it, the presence cold and oppressive, lingering right at my bedside. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and then, slowly, I felt a faint breath on my neck, chilling me to my core. My body froze, every muscle tense with fear. The breath was icy, hovering just over my skin. And then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, I heard it, a low, sinister murmur that made my blood run cold. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably malicious, a dark promise lingering in the stillness. The breath faded, but I couldn't bring myself to move, couldn't dare to look over my shoulder to see if something stood there, watching. I lay motionless, my mind racing, trying to understand what had happened. For the rest of the night, I didn't dare close my eyes, didn't dare move a muscle. I waited, every second stretching into eternity, until the first light of dawn crept through the window, chasing away the shadows that had claimed the house for their own. But the house felt different now, its presence heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever haunted these halls had taken an interest in me, drawn by some strange force. It was as if the house itself were alive, feeding off my fear, growing bolder, more insistent with each passing night. The footsteps continued, each one a reminder of the darkness that lingered within the walls, of the invisible force that watched and waited. The house had drawn me into its web, and now I was trapped within its grasp, a silent witness to the echoes of those who had come before, caught in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. And as the days wore on, I realized the terrible truth. The house was not just haunted. It was hungry, and I was its latest offering. There is an old saying that curiosity is a dangerous thing. I used to think it was just one of those platitudes people offer to excuse fear or ignorance, but now I know better. Here, in this house, curiosity is not just a danger. It's a slow poison, a weight that drags you further and further into its depths. For all my searching, all my frantic nights and unanswered questions, I am no closer to understanding why the house clings to its residents, what it wants, or why it cannot bear to let go. The house is quiet as I write this, as though it's listening, waiting to see what words I'll leave behind. I have come to believe it's not haunted in any conventional sense. It is not just a place that spirits pass through or even linger within. No, it is something far stranger and more insidious. The house seems to remember, its walls retaining every sorrow, every tragedy, every desperate hope or terrible fear. It is as though the house itself has a memory, one that stretches back long before my family arrived and will continue long after we're gone. I think now of all those families before us, and I wonder if they, too, felt the weight of that memory, if they knew they were part of something larger and darker than themselves. The scrapbook in the attic, the bloodstains that reappear, the vanishing furniture, the creaking steps, and those footsteps beside my bed. They were all pieces of a story that is endlessly retold. Each new family is a chapter, each resident a line in the tale that the house is writing, one that it insists on repeating, time after time. If anyone were to stumble upon these words, I would offer them a warning, though I know most wouldn't heed it. The house lures you in with its beauty, its history, its quiet charm. But once you're inside, it begins to sink its claws into you, in ways so subtle that you don't notice until it's too late. And by then, you're already part of its story, inextricably bound to its fate. This house doesn't let go. It simply waits. It waits for the next family, the next soul that will walk across its floors, brush past its walls, and wonder at the slight chill in the air. I imagine that in a few months, or perhaps a year or two, we'll find ourselves unable to stay here any longer. The footsteps, the stains, the whispers, they're too much. They're a constant reminder that we're not welcome here, not truly. And yet I can feel the house urging us to stay, as if we're tied to it in some inexplicable way. When we finally leave, I doubt we'll be able to take everything with us. I have a feeling that certain things, certain memories, certain shadows will linger. We will carry the house with us in our minds, in our dreams, perhaps even in the way we speak or walk. And the house, I am sure, will remember us too. We will be part of its collection, another chapter in its endless book of misfortune and mystery, another voice in the chorus that whispers and paces and sighs through these rooms. To anyone who follows, who feels the draw of this place and the curiosity to uncover its secrets, I would urge caution. Not everything is meant to be understood, and not every mystery should be solved. Some things I have learned are best left undisturbed, allowed to sleep quietly in the past. But I know my words are in vain. The house has a way of luring people in, pulling them into its orbit, as though it knows it cannot exist without us. And so, I leave this here, one last mark on its walls, one final whisper in the dark. I am part of this house now, just as it is part of me. But I know that, in time, it will find someone new. It will watch them, study them, learn their fears and weaknesses, and then, piece by piece, it will unravel them until they too become just another echo in its halls. This house never truly lets go of its residents. It simply waits for the next,